Did you know super game improvement clubs are a thing? Well, we've got some to test out today, as well as what might be the best looking game improvement club to date. So today I've got the new SIM2 Max and the SIM2 Max OS irons here, and I have to say they look rather spectacular. I love this new catback design we've got here, which is meant to increase ball speed, so it's going to give you more distance. Now I've also got last year's SIM offering, so we're going to put these head to head and see just what the changes are. Now although these look pretty different from the back, visually over the ball they're not that much different. One big difference is last year's club's a lot more shiny. We've definitely got a lot more of a matte look this year, which means the section with the grooves on blends in more with the overall club head. Now, to me, this year's offering looks slightly smaller, but I'm not sure if that's just a trick of the eye down to the new visuals. Overall, in terms of a game improvement club, this is pretty good in terms of offset and aesthetics. Yes, you've got a slightly thicker top line than you would see with maybe something in the P series, but really it's not that different in terms of visuals overall. Okay, let's hit this year's SIM2 Max and see how it performs. Strike felt pretty good. Definitely flew very high. Felt like I caught that a bit thin, but it still had a really nice high ball flight, which is definitely good in terms of forgiveness. Now this does feel pretty solid off the face, but it doesn't quite compare to my P770s. It almost is a little bit tinnier. These have been very consistent so far. Now these have a pretty big sole, but honestly the turf interaction feels pretty good here. It doesn't really feel like I'm getting matty strikes at all, which is definitely quite surprising for a game improvement club of this size. Okay, so the big thing you all want to know, how far did this go? Well, this averaged out at 164 yards, which is pretty long for a 7-iron, and I have to say I think if I'd hit more shots this average would have been higher, because my last 6 shots the worst shot was 164 and I got some shots out at 168. So I definitely saw that as I got more comfortable with this I started hitting it better and further. And to be honest, those last 7 shots were remarkably consistent. My front to back was only 5 yards, and in terms of dispersion I was really pleased too. Now, as we've seen with most of the game improvement irons I've tested this year, the spin was a bit low, but obviously that's offset with the fact that these launch so high and they have a really steep descent angle. So that's kind of balancing out, and it's going to help you stop these on the green. In terms of shot shape, I was really pleased because often with this style of club I don't feel like I can hit that little draw that I like to hit, but to be honest with these, I didn't find that that was the case at all. These are definitely offering something that's easy to launch, although I would say the height was slightly inconsistent. Now the big story here is distance, so let's go back to last year's offering and see what we've gained. Now I've got the same KBS Max shaft in this, and it is 85 grams as well, but this is a stiff and we had a regular in this year's offering, so that's going to probably tweak the performance a little bit. Having said that, I do normally use a stiff shaft, so I'm not sure which is actually going to help me out the most. Definitely launched a little bit lower there. That felt good. Seem to be hitting these a little bit further right than I was with this year's SIM2 offering. These still feel pretty good too, but I think there is a bit of a noticeable difference between this, which is more hollowed out at the back, and the new design that has that catback design. Oh, close to that. It's remarkable how few shots I'm actually hitting left with both of these. Normally as soon as you put a game improvement club in my hands, I'm like, hello, left side of the golf course. So I actually lost 4 yards of distance there, with my average going down to 160. Now it was also quite interesting because my longest shot with this was also 4 yards shorter than my longest shot with the SIM2 Max. Now another noticeable thing for me was this didn't feel quite as easy to control. I lost a few more shots to the right and I didn't have that little draw I like quite as much. And we also saw that in the overall dispersion, which wasn't quite as tight. But then to be honest, in terms of other variables, the launch, the descent angle, the spin, were all almost identical to last year's offering. Now 4 yards might not necessarily sound that much, but when you think about it, it's nearly half a club in distance. So for year on year, I do think that's quite a big improvement. And I definitely would say that the new SIM2 Max just felt more forgiving and easier to hit, and that was kind of brought out in my shot shape and the consistency of that. Whereas with this one, my shots were a lot more all over the place. Right, we've hit the Sim Max and the SIM2 Max game improvement offerings. Now let's go back and hit the SIM2 Max OS and see just what the differences are. Now in terms of the aesthetics, this is definitely quite a bit bigger than the Max in terms of sole width. But then when you turn it over and put it behind the ball, honestly there's not that much difference in terms of shaping. The blade length's very similar, the top line's very similar. The only thing that's quite a bit different is there's definitely a little bit more offset here. Still launched pretty high, definitely felt a little bit matty though. Hit a nice little draw there that literally landed straight on the line though. Take that, of course. Pretty good dispersion so far too. That felt like it went a long way. I actually feel like I can really go after this without worrying about my dispersion, which is definitely nice. I'm actually really enjoying hitting this. I just loved the trajectory of that. Right, so it's not very surprising to hear that this had the highest peak height and it also had the steepest descent angle. So that's going to really help you out in terms of having that really high ball flight and getting the balls to land softly on the green. In terms of distance, this averaged out at 165, which is only 1 yard further than the Max. But then if we look at front to back dispersion and kind of compared best shots with each, this was definitely longer. I had one shot that went at 171 with this compared to my best, which was 167 with the Max. And also my shortest shot with this was 164 compared to 157 with the Max. So we're definitely seeing a bit more distance there from worst to best shot compared to just the average. I mean, 171 for a 7-iron, that's ridiculous for me. In terms of shot shape, this is really interesting because it was definitely a little bit more draw biased, and actually my dispersion was really tight. I was expecting it to be a lot bigger with this just because of the bigger sole and the fact that I might not be quite comfortable with this, but I actually hit this really well. Right, now let's see how this compares to last year's offering. Now again, visually there's not a massive difference here. We have got that shiny finish here compared to the more matte look that we've got this year, and I also think the back of the top line isn't as rounded off, so it looks slightly bigger even though it's quite similar in size. That was a very nice shot shape. I have to say all 4 of these clubs sit really well behind the ball. Typically with some game improvement clubs I don't always feel like they're quite square, and a lot of the time it feels like the toe sits quite up, but you really don't have that with this at all, and it definitely gives you more confidence over the ball. So far I don't think the dispersion's quite as good with this. So the average distance there was exactly the same as it was with the SIM2 offering. But then in terms of front to back dispersion, we actually saw quite a big difference. The worst shot with this was down at 157, whereas with the SIM2 it was up at 163. So that's 6 yards difference, so my worst shot was 6 yards better with this year's. In terms of my best shots, I had 2 shots here at 170, which was 1 yard shorter than my best shot with the SIM2, so not really much difference there. With this I had a slightly lower launch angle and ball flight, and I also had a lower descent angle, so it wasn't getting quite as high and it wasn't coming down and dropping as softly. But the biggest difference was clearly in terms of dispersion. The new SIM2 was like 50% better than this. I was just hitting it so much closer, and also it was more consistent. With this I had quite big misses to both the left and the right, whereas with the SIM2 I had a much more consistent draw shot shape. These are super game improvement clubs, and the key here is all about forgiveness. So I think that dispersion is really important because really that's what people are going to be looking for. rather than an extra 1 or 2 yards. So I've really enjoyed hitting these. I think after testing these out, these have to be my favourite looking game improvement irons. Obviously they look really nice from the back, but also over the ball in terms of the shaping and the fact that there's not too much offset there. If we're looking at performance overall, in terms of the SIM Max, I think we definitely saw about half a club more distance than last year's offering and a little bit of an improvement in terms of forgiveness. Then when it comes to the SIM2 Max OS, forgiveness was definitely the key story here. Honestly, the dispersion was head and shoulders better than last year's offering, so it's definitely worth looking at this if that's what you need. If you're not sure which of these to choose, I would say there's not that much difference in terms of distance, but the Max OS definitely flew a bit further in terms of my best shots. Overall, the dispersion was definitely the tightest with this model, so you're going to want to be looking at that if you're looking for maximum forgiveness. But then again, you've got to remember this is a smaller head, so if that visual suits you, you're not really giving up any distance, so it's definitely going to be something you prefer to look at the Max model. Right, that's all for today. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comments below or send me a line on Twitter or Instagram. I've already reviewed the rest of the TaylorMade SIM2 range, so if you want to check that out, head to the TaylorMade playlist. If you're new to the channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications too. And if you're after more golf content, head to the National Club Golfer social media channels for more.